Okay, confession time. This is now the 5th time in a row that I've tried to write a full script for Silksong, and if I'm being quite honest with you, I'm kind of just losing my mind. At first I tried to write for something that was a bit more negative, calling out the game for how annoying it can be, while also not fixing some of my issues from the previous game, or fixing them, but just in a way that made the rest of the game worse. But then I thought to myself that was being a bit too negative. After all, at the end of the day, I really do love this game. So I decided instead that I would be a bit more positive, focusing on how beautiful the game looked, how much variety there is, and how much of a steal it is for the price. But then I thought to myself, wait a minute, this game is a giant dickweed, and fuck bile water. So then I tried to write for something that was a little in between, you know? And then I kind of got hit with the crippling realization that it's actually really difficult to both be neutral and interesting at the same time. I went back, and then forward, and then back, and then forward, and then back, and here we are, staring at a stupid PNG of Hornet because I want to meet some arbitrary deadline, but also I don't actually have anything done. Don't worry guys, I went to college. I know exactly how to handle this. Silksong is one of the most confusing games that I've ever had to critique before. More than Hollow Knight, more than Monster Hunter Wilds, more than my life. Somehow. Not just in the fact that it has a lot of controversial elements in it, but also because it annoyed me to no end at every single turn, and yet, for some reason, I still love it. Since we've already gone off the cliff in this intro, here's a little snippet from one of my previous scripts. I watched my entire first playthrough all over again and counted every single time the game had a platforming section that also had some flying enemy or equivalent threatening to knock you back down. The total number I got at the end was 40 times, and in my head I'm thinking, that's inexcusable. I can't think of something more annoying than trying to explore a level or complete a platforming section only for some seemingly unpredictable mosquito dropping down from the heavens trying to reverse it all. I went back to the first Hollow Knight to see if this was the case too, and the number of similar instances didn't even hit the double digits. At the same time though, when I searched my feelings very honestly, I didn't really mind when the game did this while I was playing. In fact, I thought that those enemies kind of made the platforming sections a little bit interesting. A similar thing happened with the Courier Rash quest, a delivery challenge where you have to go through Shellwood, the Blasted Steppes, and almost half of the Citadel without getting hit more than a couple of times within a certain time frame. If that sounds really difficult, that's because it is, at least in the way that I did it. I attempted to do this quest with only the dash, the wall jump, and the float, and it took me over an hour to get right. Now, I could have done this quest when I had more movement abilities later, but since the game was pretty difficult so far, I thought that the nail upgrade associated to the questline would be smart to have early on. Sure, it was more difficult this way, but I assumed that the increase in overall damage from the reward would be enough to offset the time wasted. Turns out though that this was all for nothing, because one of the other parts of the questline requires the double jump in order to progress it, meaning that there's absolutely zero reason to do this without the double jump and the claw line. Obviously, I didn't know this at the time, and aside from looking it up online, there's no possible way I really could have. Why would Team Cherry do this? Why would they let you try this gruesome platforming gauntlet without having the claw line and double jump when the reward for the quest is locked behind them anyways? That's stupid. It's borderline sadistic. And yet, I actually kind of liked it. Memorizing the routes, learning the little tricks to avoid the enemies, and slowly getting better at the platforming was all pretty enjoyable, and despite how tedious it was and how much I insist that I hate it, it was by far the most memorable moment in the entire game for me, which is something that I value a lot. What's wrong with me? Is this Stockholm Syndrome? Maybe I just have skin a mile thick from years and years of From Software's bullshit. Maybe it goes even deeper than that. Maybe on some level, I actually like being annoyed. Maybe all games are annoyances. Maybe all life is just annoyances. Silksong changed me, man. Okay, maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration, but the point is that I'm confused and scared. In my previous video, I described Hollow Knight as a love and hate relationship, and I'm shocked that I can say the exact same thing about Silksong, just in a completely different way. In that I love the game because I hate it. Yeah, that's gonna be a fun one to explain. Let's start off with the parts of the game that, even after losing my mind, I don't defend, like the boss runbacks. First, I want to try and dissect what's even the point of these runbacks, and whether or not the benefits outweigh the cons. Like everything in life, this can all be traced back to Dark Souls. Back in the day, the main argument for runbacks in that game by every Joe Schmo on YouTube was that it increased the amount of tension the game had even outside of the boss fights. That the run-up to the bosses were like a little test, and if you didn't do well enough on them, well then, tough shit. You're going in with half your healing, maybe even less. This forces the player to treat even the regular enemies as seriously as the bosses themselves. From Software wanted you to be on edge and pay attention all of the time, not just while you were fighting the bosses. This is an argument that I bought when I was 12, but not anymore, and if you play Dark Souls, you know why. Everyone always just runs past these enemies. There's not a single Dark Soul in the entire universe who seriously fights every single entity on their way back to a boss. I guess it makes you memorize a route better to get by safely, but not about the rest of the game, or the regular enemies, or anything worth any sort of significance. The second argument for runbacks, and strangely enough the most valid one to me, is that it helps with immersion. That if every single boss had a checkpoint right before it, like a video game, that players are less likely to see the world as a real living place. I say this one is the most valid, but I'm more so saying that it's such a vague and subjective argument that it's really hard to tackle. I can't fight ghosts, okay? For some people this will be true, I guess, but for me it's really not. The last argument is that runbacks increase the amount of stakes that a boss fight has. If a boss has the potential to just wipe away a minute of your real life every time you want to try it, then you actually feel like you have something to lose. After all, time is money, so the game is basically forcing you to buy a microtransaction every single time you want to fight the boss again. And okay, that does give the boss more stakes. Does having a machine that kicks you in your in real life balls every single time you get hit a good addition to a game too? We will see about that one. Right now though, this is still a video about Silksong, so I have to bring up the really obvious fact that it is not exactly like Dark Souls. The biggest difference here is that Silksong's runbacks are way more involved. It's not just about how well you can kite a stupid enemy or press the stick at a certain direction, there's some actual gameplay here, so that first argument that I spoke about is suddenly back on the table. There have been arguments from some people that learning the platforming to get back to the bosses in the most efficient manner is pretty fun, and that they enjoyed it. And while I'm happy for those people, I also have the right to disagree with them and call them weirdos. Okay, I feel like I'm slowly but surely becoming that one meme of the guy yelling at other people to stop having fun. So I just want to say that I don't actually think that you're a weirdo. You're like beautiful or something. What I'm trying to say is that when you get your butt handed to you by a boss, what is almost everyone's very first instinct directly afterwards? Again, right? You want to try again. You don't want to platform around and deal with some random enemies before fighting the boss. No, you want the boss. This is ultimately the problem with these types of runbacks. They're forcing you to engage with one part of the game at a moment when you really want to engage with another part of it. Anytime this sort of thing happens will feel like a waste to most people, regardless of how fun the forced parts are in isolation or how long they take. Speaking of which, are these runbacks even as bad as people say they are, or is this another case of gamers being gamers? When you hear people complain about the runbacks in this game, there are 4 different candidates that they'll likely bring up: The Last Judge, Raging Conchfly, Growl the Great, and the Clover Dancers. Now, if you're anything like me and you like numbers, chances are your first instinct would be to go through all of these runbacks as optimally as possible and measure how long each of them takes in order to see how bad they really are. And that's what I did, getting these times on your screen right now. Measurements like these are something that other people have already brought up to deflect any sort of criticism levied against these runbacks. That when going as fast as possible after practicing the runback over and over again, that Last Judge really isn't that bad because she only lasts about like half a minute, right? If that last sentence sounded satirical and sarcastic, that's because it was. This argument is bad. Knowing these runbacks like the back of your hand and having a lot of experience going through them over and over again is not how most people will experience the game on their first playthrough. This is something we'll talk about later, but a lot of people seem to expect other players to be good at the game right from the minute that they pick it up. That's not going to happen. Chances are for the first 3 or so times you'll fumble around a little bit, get hit a couple of times, maybe even die. That's the real life, actual experience for most people. Yes, once they get the hang of it, then it won't be so bad, but you can't just ignore everything that came before it. The developers still have to make that process of learning fun, and once again, if you're forcing them to do it to get to the part that they actually want, then it's not going to be fun. When all is said and done, I wouldn't really be surprised if these times doubled in the actual expected conditions. I know that me doubling these times might seem like something I kinda pulled out my ass, but you have to remember, I like numbers. The Last Judge's practice time was 35 seconds, right? Vine Sauce, 1 minute and 19 seconds. Distortion 2, 1 minute and 12 seconds. Point Crow, 1 minute. Moist Critical, 56 seconds. Fireborn, 1 minute and 2 seconds. Moon Moon, 1 minute and 15 seconds. And finally me, 1 minute and 4 seconds. These are the average times of the first 3 runbacks of The Last Judge by all of these people, and all of them got very close to doubling from the measured value from earlier, and some of them flat out did. By the way, 3 of these guys are speedrunners, and while the rest aren't anywhere close to being on that level, they've still all been playing video games for a good chunk of their lives, and have a lot of experience with gaming just in general. Now, imagine someone who isn't good at video games doing these runbacks instead, and doubling these measured times is pretty much a given, and even tripling them suddenly isn't so out there, is it? If these times still don't seem too bad to you, then how about you and I do a little thought experiment, okay? Imagine you're watching your favorite Twitch streamer or TikToker or whatever, and suddenly 3 unskippable 30-second ads pop up out of nowhere, all of which have a little quiz attached to the end of them, which you have to pass in order to continue watching. Yeah, that's how bad the runbacks are in this game. I know that to some of you that might seem like an unfair comparison, but to me they're functionally the same thing. I want to do something, and the game tells me, no, you can't. Do this thing first that's not brain dead enough for you to autopilot, but also not engaging enough to distract you from what you actually want to do. If you're wondering if these 4 bosses are the only ones in the entire game with bad runbacks, then the answer is kind of. After doing some more testing, I found 5 other bosses with runbacks just as bad as these guys numerically, but they either are so easy that most people can first try them and therefore never have to do the runbacks in the first place, or the runbacks themselves are really straightforward, so the time doesn't balloon when you put them under real world conditions. This means it doesn't ruin the game. I want to remind you that I like Silksong, I do like this game, but still having about 9 bosses with this problem is still an issue. That number should be 0. I was a bit curious actually, so I went back to the first Hollow Knight and tested that game's worst runbacks as well. After all was said and done, Mantis Lords had a runback of 41 seconds, Trader Lord 50 seconds, and Hive Knight 54 seconds. This means that on average, Silksong's worst runbacks are 1.9 seconds longer than Hollow Knight's. Get on, kid. I don't make the rules. Except when I clearly do. Okay. So the big plot twist here is that after all of my complaining, that this was also a problem that the first Hollow Knight had too. A problem that I probably didn't mention in my last video because I first tried most of the bosses while I was replaying it. I still hold my position on the grounds that just because something sucked before doesn't mean that it doesn't suddenly suck now. You had a Twitter account yesterday, that doesn't mean you should have one today. But yeah, if you're someone who was annoyed that people forgot that this was an issue in Hollow Knight, then you're like super valid or something, I guess. Believe me when I say that I really tried to weasel my way out of admitting that last part. I thought I could rely on the platforming being harder as a factor, but then I remembered the bees. So there went that. The only possible out I saw was claiming that since the bosses in Silksong are harder, that the chances that these runbacks will occur is much higher, which is true, but I don't know if that's really fair to the runbacks themselves in isolation. Speaking of which, yeah, Silksong is more difficult than Hollow Knight. Before we do anything drastic, I would just like you to know that I don't think that difficulty is inherently a good or a bad thing. That sort of thing usually comes down to who you are and what you like. It's not some sort of indictment of your personality or anything that the internet wants you to believe. If you just want to turn your brain off and relax while you're playing a game, then that is more than fine. And if you want a game so hard that it makes you want to eat your controller, well then make sure you get the battery, because more power to. So why is the difficulty in this section then? Well, it's because I don't think that the difficulty in this game is particularly well done. Just because it relies on preferences doesn't mean you can just throw the entire thing out the window. Ideally, a game should start at its easiest and then progressively get harder and harder until it peaks right at the end. The reason behind this is because punting players off of a cliff while they're still getting used to the controls and learning the mechanics will just double up on their frustrations, making them more likely to quit. Instead, what you should do is give them some room and time to learn the fundamentals first, and then you punt them off the cliff. The player is at their worst at the beginning, and they're at their best at the end, so the game should adjust the difficulty accordingly. Unless there's a specific intent behind an unconventional difficulty curve, this is how I expect difficulty to work in pretty much every game. Silksong's difficulty is more like this though. Aside from a couple of fights, I actually found that the game got way easier as it went on. Which means one or two things. Either one, the game has failed to ramp up the difficulty in the late game, or two, the game at the beginning is just a bit too difficult. Truthfully, it could be both of them, but for now, let me just focus on the one that I think is the bigger problem, which is that one. There are 3 reasons why I think the beginning is so much more difficult than the rest of the game. The amount of health that you're given, the new healing system, and early sources of 2 points of damage. First, let me write out Silksong's healing system in plain English so that we're all on the same page, okay? Don't worry, this will be quick. In order to start healing in Silksong, you need 9 points of dread. You gain 1 point of dread every time you hit an enemy or a boss, and once you start to heal, you can't stop. You have to go through the entire animation. If you're successful, then you get back 3 points of health, but if you're interrupted, then not only do you not heal, but also you lose all of the dread that you had at that moment, even any excess dread that wasn't being used for the heal. As you'll see later in this video, there isn't anything inherently wrong with this system, but it can be extremely unforgiving when put under the correct conditions. Conditions like, I don't know, having 5 max health and being surrounded with enemies and hazards that have some way of dealing 2 points of damage. The way I see it, there are 2 ways to play Silksong given these conditions. You can either play it like Michael, or you can play it like Kevin. Michael is a bit of a daredevil and will only heal if he's on 2 or 1 point of health. His reasoning is that since you're healing for 3, waiting until this point at your health range is the best because you don't waste any dread in the process. Sure, he puts himself 1 hit away from dying by doing this, but he's convinced that the efficiency is more than worth the risk. Kevin, on the other hand, is a bit more pragmatic. He realizes that no matter what, humans will always make mistakes, and therefore gives himself a little bit of a buffer to mess up by only healing at 3 or 4 points of health. Yes, he wastes some dread doing this, but the safety of being able to take a hit for messing up healing will inch him along more times than not. A question for you. Who do you think has the better strategy? The answer is I don't know. However, what I do know is that no matter which strategy you adopt, messing up healing against an attack that does 2 damage is pretty much certain death. Michael obviously is just dead outright, and while Kevin is alive, he's still in something that I would like to refer to as the crap zone. A state of play where you're at death's door with absolutely no resources to heal back. In this state, Kevin would need to land 9 consecutive hits without ever getting touched. Obviously, that sounds really harsh. You're not dead, but you might as well be, come on. To illustrate just how punishing this is, let's compare this graphic with the exact same one from the beginning of Hollow Knight. For one, most enemies, hazards, and bosses in that game only do 1 health of damage, so the new zone of danger is right here. Next, we have to take into account that healing is 1 mass per a third of your soul meter, so the range at which healing is the most efficient is actually here. In essence, Michael doesn't even exist anymore. He can't because the most efficient time to heal is pretty much just whenever you don't have full health. Finally, we have the fact that Hollow Knight doesn't dump all of your resources for getting hit out of a heal, and healing only requires 3 hits to get back. This means that the crap zone doesn't exist either. Even at its absolute worst, which is this situation here, you would still only need to hit something about 3 times in order to get out of the range where you can die, as opposed to Silksong's 9. Getting into this situation, by the way, is way harder. You would need to 1. Get hit out of a heal, 2. Be on 2 health, and 3. Only have a third of your soul meter left. Silksong only really requires you to get hit out of a heal from an attack that deals 2 damage. That's really it. But wait, you might say, doesn't this whole situation go away once you get 6 or even 7 points of health? To which I have to say, I was getting to that. Shut up. This is my video. At 6 health, there is now a zone where you can be like Kevin without the risk of entering the crap zone. 7 health allows you to take a reasonable middle ground approach to both Kevin and Michael's approaches, and 8 is where Michael stops existing again. This healing system starts to feel more manageable as you go further and further into the game. I hope that after all of this work I did to explain this to you, that your response isn't to assume that I'm saying that the healing in Silksong is worse. Because if so, I'm hanging up this whole YouTube thing and pursuing my lifelong dream of selling bridges. I'm not saying that at all. In fact, I'm confident in saying that once you get the hang of it and also get the wall jump, that the healing in Silksong just straight up becomes more powerful than it was in Hollow Knight. It's not worse, it's just more punishing to mess up, especially when you have only 5 or 6 points of health, which is just true. This is why I'm only really complaining about the difficulty in the beginning of the game. Not only because that's when you're the most likely to have less health, but also because it's the only point in the game where I don't think that skill issue is a valid counter-argument. If someone still heals poorly at the end of the game, well, that's between them and a literal god, right? They've had a whole game to get better at it, so as far as I'm concerned, breaking their legs and throwing them into the abyss is a perfectly reasonable response. The start is a completely different story though. I don't know if you can tell based on the writing so far, but I see myself as a very sympathetic person, which is why I believe that you shouldn't be expected to be good at a game right from the moment that you pick it up. The fact that you're punished more at the point of the game where you're the most likely to mess healing up is completely backwards. It should almost always be the other way around. I guess what I'm actually trying to say is that every boss in Act 3 should do 4, maybe even 5 points of damage, and yeah, that should fix it. Since I even dare to utter out the phrase skill issue, I guess I should also address the very common argument that the game isn't actually harder because you have more tools at your disposal. I really don't like this line of thought for 2 specific reasons. One is that not every player will enjoy using these tools. The way I see it, there are 4 types of people who will play Silksong. People who like using the tools and want to make the game easier, people who hate using the tools and don't want to make the game easier, people who like using the tools but don't want to make the game easier, and people who hate using the tools but do want to make the game easier. I know that last sentence was a bit of a word salad with punctuation on the side, so I made the exact same thing for Elden Ring and the summons, just so we can all be on the same page, okay? If you're in the blue groups, then you're all good to be you, and if you're in the red groups, well, it just kind of sucks, you know? This is why these topics can be so divisive, because people with conflicting opinions about the difficulty of the game and the mechanics that make them easier end up just feeling like they're compromising instead of getting the best of both worlds. In the end, this is why I always advocate for just straight up difficulty modes, because they don't directly add or subtract mechanics from the game while also still allowing people to modify the difficulty to their own preferences. The second reason is because while you're playing the game for the very first time, you don't even know that these tools exist yet. You can't be like, oh, I really hate this maggot debuff, you know what, I'm just gonna go to the putrefied ducks and get the one charm that makes it kinda bearable, because you don't even know that it exists yet. You might not even know that the putrefied ducks exist yet. Sure, exploring more could get you something useful, or it could just be a waste of time, and the real problem was always you. You won't know that until you explore everything 100%, which is completely unreasonable, especially for areas that you've already been to. Thankfully, the elegance of my previous argument is that the beginning has less tools, therefore they play less of a factor when smoothing out the difficulty. Boom, checkmate. And oh, what's this? During my catatonic breakdown writing this script, Team Cherry actually nerfed the early game, proving that I'm right? That's a double checkmate. Wait a minute. Doesn't that mean that this problem doesn't exist anymore? That version is still the one that millions of people have played already, so I feel comfortable in leaving this in. It's my video. Okay, one more thing to complain about, and then I promise that afterwards, it'll all be sunny skies from there. I really don't like the quests in this game. Sometimes they'll lead to an actually interesting boss, but 9 times out of 10, they're usually something really mundane, like collect X amount of stuff, or find this NPC, or give us 400 rosaries, or we'll break your legs, boring stuff like that. Now let me just make it clear that if the quests were completely separate from the core gameplay, then I would be more than fine with them existing. Completionist nuts or people who really want the rewards can do them if they want to, while I could just ignore them and play the parts of the game that I actually like. Unfortunately, for some reason, Team Cherry decided that you need to do 17 of them if you want to get to Act 3. Considering that Act 3 has the true ending and some of my favorite bosses in the entire game, this really blows, and the worst part is that I don't even know why they needed to do this. I would like to say that the developers were just really worried that players would miss out on the absolutely life-changing event that is collecting 10 fine pins every single time they want to replay the game, but the conditions for unlocking Act 3 are already so obscure that I don't really think that missing out was really their concern. If it was about the unique rewards attached to them, then they could have just been moved to the vendors. And if it was about immersion, then that simply isn't a good enough reason. The best answer that I could find to why this needed to be a thing is that hiding away Act 3 behind all of these conditions makes its sudden reveal even cooler. And yeah, okay, that reveal was pretty cool, but I don't think that it was at all worth making players engage with the mediocre quests and shooting the game's replayability in the foot. I always play games at least twice before making these videos, and going back to unlock all of Act 3 was easily the least fun part of my second time through. Okay, so before we get to the parts of the game that I actually really like, let me just complain about one more thing, okay? I have no evidence to support my argument here, but we can all agree that the game is kind of a dick, right? Like, genuinely hostile for no good reason, right? Right? Okay. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Thanks for agreeing with me. You've always been my favorite viewer. We can go on now. Okay, so I know that this is going to sound a bit weird, but for this section, I'm literally just going to insert a part from a previously scrapped version of this video. Although, I guess because I'm using it now, it's technically not scrapped, but you know what I mean, right? It's just going to be a bit different. Basically, what happened was that this section was going to be all positive and joyful-like, but the totally real, not arbitrary deadline is slowly approaching, so I had to reuse something in order to meet that deadline. Fair warning, the tone is going to be quite a bit different. On my first couple of scripts, I took myself way more seriously than the final one, and more importantly than that, none of them had any funny drawings in mind, so you're not going to get those either. Here's a good one to pass you over though. If old me really is that unbearable, then skip over to this timestamp in the video, or, stop watching, I guess. Hey, it's your life, and hey, how about this? Every single time that old me brings up something that is completely irrelevant, I'll just put a giant lol sign over the screen so we can all point and laugh at him, okay? How does that sound? Good? Okay, enjoy. The first thing that I want to do is look at every single problem I listed out in my previous video on Hollow Knight and see how Silksong tried to improve on them, if at all. I am once again encouraging you to watch that last video because you know what, it's fine. You don't have to watch it, really, it's fine. Here are all of those problems I mentioned there in a short listed format. Obviously, I can't explain all of these issues as thoroughly here, but it should still give you at least a general idea of my issues with the last game, and I'll do my best to at least mention the important parts. The first problem on this list is appropriately enough about the beginning, so let's start there. At first, it seems like Silksong is going to start off in the exact same fashion as Hollow Knight. You start off in a small tutorial zone with a rather slow and simple moveset, make your way through a small rundown village before being forced down a rather linear path until you get your first 2 upgrades. While a couple of bits have moved around here and there, Silksong's forced path through a tutorial zone, Bone Bottom, the Marrow, Moss Grotto, and Deep Docks undoubtedly resembles Hollow Knight's beginning through a tutorial zone, Dirtmouth, Forgotten Crossroads, and Green Path, even almost down to their exact aesthetics and the types of power-ups you get along the way. If you watched my previous video on Hollow Knight, then you should know 2 really specific things about me. The first thing is that the beginning was easily my least favorite part of exploration in that game. While the backtracking in Hollow Knight was fine overall, in the beginning specifically, it was really unbearable and monotonous due to a slow, uninteresting starting moveset, out of the way dead ends connected by long hallways, and the forced linearity of the first few areas. In theory, Silksong's opening resembling so much of Hollow Knight's seems like my worst nightmare, and it would be if I was in fact telling you the whole truth. Which is the second thing that you should know about me, is that I like lying sometimes because I want to see if you're actually listening to me and thinking for yourself. I wasn't exactly making stuff up here, but the truth is that while the big picture of both games are very similar, that there are some key differences that I purposely omitted that really makes my core problem with Hollow Knight's opening go away. Let's start with the linearity claim, since it's the much easier one to discredit. In the first Hollow Knight, the order in which you explore areas in the beginning is King's Pass, Forgotten Crossroads, Green Path, a small glimpse of Fog Canyon, and then finally the Fungal Waste. No matter what, the opening to the game forced you through all of those areas in that exact order. There wasn't any decision you got to make to suit your own preferences, and it made exploration feel really one note, since it seems like you'll always be pigeonholed down a set path anyways. Silksong does force you through Moss Grotto and the Marrow, but exploration after that becomes quite different. First, there's a choice you get to make between going through Hunter's March or the left side of Deep Docks in order to get the dash. The latter is the normal intended path, and the former is the one for people who want more of a challenge. After you get done with that, then you can choose to either buy the simple key for a path down Worm's Way or continue on to Farfield. The Farfield path will get you a hover ability, while the Worm's Way path is the fastest way to get to the wall jump. I'll get to how exploration is different in both games overall later, but just sticking to this opening, it's easy to see that Silksong is more willing to give you meaningful decisions to navigate the world much earlier than Hollow Knight did. Because those decisions are present, every path suddenly feels like it has the potential to lead to something new, and exploring becomes more enticing. The other point about long dead ends is also pretty much gone thanks to overall smarter level design. There are two instances that this could even be considered a problem. The first is in the Marrow, where you hit the other side of a travelator and need to backtrack back to Moss Grotto, and the other is this long vertical area in the deep docks next to the blacksmith. Neither of these instances even holds a candle to the two jellyfish hallways from the first game, nor are either of them so completely pointless and time-wasting than these completely empty rooms from the Forgotten Crossroads and Green Path. Every other dead end seems to have taken the Blasphemous 2 method of having them be right next to the critical path to make the backtracking less of a thing. Here are some of those instances I'm talking about right now on your screen. I guess there is the unfortunate circumstance where you fall down specific spots and are forced to backtrack up, but all of these spots are reasonably avoidable as long as you're paying attention. So great, 2 out of 3. Good job, Silksong. Unfortunately, I am picky as all hell, so I'll have to say that Silksong was ruined and fell off because it didn't have this one change to movement that I was really hoping for. Considering that getting the dash is much faster this time, the platforming a bit more interesting, and the starting area is much smaller, this isn't that huge of a deal as it was in the first game, but I still would have liked it if there was some grounded dash you could do at the start. Overall though, I think that the game does have enough changes to make the opening much more palatable than the opening to the first game. Next, let's take a look at the overall exploration for problem number 2. In Hollow Knight, once you got the Mantis Claws about 3 hours into the game, exploration, for lack of a better term, exploded all over you. You could visit Deepness, the Royal Waterways, City of Tears, Kingdom's Edge, the Hive, Ancient Basin, Howling Cliffs, and Crystal Peaks, all at once. It was a colossal amount of freedom that I rarely ever seen given in a game before, and I really loved it. But admittedly, it did kind of make exploration a bit overwhelming and kind of a mess. Getting lost was really easy. I know that that's the point, it wouldn't be a proper adventure if you didn't get lost, but even knowing this, I still think that there was some room for some compromises here. I suggested that the game should give a guidance option for players who really wanted the extra aid. It would have helped people who can't binge games all at once with navigating to the critical path, and hopefully the people who wanted to be lost could just ignore it. I don't think that this suggestion was perfect, but it was the best I could scrounge up to try and help, which is pretty much always my intention when making these videos. Team Cherry saw that kind intention, glared back with absolute disgust, and then decided to give me, and specifically me, the middle finger by making Silksong much more linear. As if to say, yeah, this is what you wanted, right? Linear may be too strong of a word. I think it's more appropriate to say that exploration in Silksong is just paced out more evenly. Instead of exploding all over your mouth at once, it instead decides to drip feed you branching decisions of just a couple of areas almost every single time you get a power up. We've already discussed the ones you get after obtaining the Silk Spear and the dash, but a similar thing happens for the wall jump, claw line, and double jump. In other words, while the beginning is much more open-ended, the middle and the ending are more linear overall. Does this fix my issue with the exploration being too confusing? Well, yeah, but obviously this isn't what I meant. I reiterate that I really did love when Hollow Knight opened up 80% of the map all at once. It improved replayability to an insane degree while also letting each player's experience feel really unique. Silksong's method isn't bad. In fact, in comparison to other Metroidvanias, it's still much more open overall. It just undoubtedly misses out on some of that magic that the first Hollow Knight had to offer. I really wish that they could have found a way to keep both the openness of the first game, just with much better signposting. It's funny because I actually do think that Silksong also delivers on that second part, but now that the world is much more straightforward, it doesn't really feel necessary anymore. I guess that I'll check this off as a yes, but it's a very shady yes. For the third problem on this list about the story feeling aimless, I'm proud to announce that this is a resounding yes, with almost no argument whatsoever. While not every video game needs a super complex and philosophical motivation for its main character, it should always at least give the players some sort of grounding behind why and what they're doing. Even if that reason is shallow, giving the main character some motivation allows the player to start caring about whether or not they succeed or fail. It helps them align themselves better with the events of the game. In the first Hollow Knight, the motivation behind why the knight was exploring hollowness in the first place was always really vague. The game floats around a couple of different possibilities like the Radiance and the Hollow Knight, but both of these answers didn't really make sense, nor did the game ever outright confirm either one of them. As a result, the story can feel really aimless. The knight arrives at Hollowness and just starts exploring for some reason until Hornet and the Dreamers gives them some vague goals that they start pursuing for some reason, and then that's it. It gets players more into the mindset of, oh, I'm exploring this place because it's a video game about exploration, instead of positioning the main character and the player behind a common goal. If you're fine with that, then that's fine, but being able to detach yourself from Hollow Knight's story and choosing to engage with it only as a game isn't the same as the story not feeling aimless. Thankfully, Silksong fixes this problem almost from minute 1. The reason why Hornet is in Varloom in the first place is because she was kidnapped and brought there sometime after the events of the first game. After she manages to escape, she makes the very logical conclusion that if she doesn't deal with this problem at its source, then she's just going to get kidnapped all over again. So she sets out for the Citadel of the Kingdom to kick some gasters and find some answers. There, boom, done. I now have a proper reason to care about the events of the game and root for Hornet as a character. Hornet in general is just a much better protagonist than the knight from the first game. It feels like half the reason why they left the knight's motivation and personality so vague in the first place is because they wanted the player to treat them like some sort of vessel. The knight's motivations are going to be whatever the player wants them to be, which sounds fine on paper, but it just ends up making them a bit boring overall. I know that some people are going to tell me that that's the point. In the actual story, a vessel is exactly what the knight is, so it makes sense why they're so devoid of any character. But whether or not this is on purpose doesn't really matter. While fitting logically, it doesn't change the fact that at the end of the day, the knight is still a silent protagonist with no personality whatsoever. A character archetype that I have never ever seen work well even once from a story perspective. Usually, games with silent protagonists have to either surround them with actually interesting characters at all times to pick up for their slack, or make the main conflict so universally applicable to everyone that every player ultimately rally behind the exact same motivation because it just makes sense. Hornet doesn't need either of those things. She's her own person, she has her own thoughts and opinions, she slaps people. I really like that she slaps people. I feel like I am going to say this a lot as I keep on making videos, but I want to clarify that just because I appreciate that Hornet is her own person, doesn't mean that I think her character is some god tier complex, multi-layered interesting personality. Like the actual story surrounding her, Hornet clocks in exactly on time for her shift, and she clocks out exactly on time too. And that's really all I needed from this type of game. Since we're already on the story, let's also talk about the deep, absolutely fascinating lore of Silksong as well for problem number 4. The lore is that Mossbag has not released a video at the time of me writing this script, so I'm just going to leave some question marks near here, yeah. That just leaves the bosses for problem number 5. I feel like a broken record at this point, but can you just watch the last video, please? I put so much work into it, man, and It didn't really. I mean, you don't even have to watch the whole thing. You can just skip around. I just you know what? It's fine. It's fine. You have to watch the last video. It's fine. My main issue with a lot of the bosses in the last game had to do with their refusal to force players into using certain defensive options for their fights. The wall jump and the double jump in particular were sorely neglected. Shade Cloak was too, but at least I can understand that one due to how late in the game you can obtain it. In general, my favorite bosses were the very few that pushed your full moveset to its full potential, such as Absolute Radiance and Pure Vessel. To support my argument, I did what I always do and made a list with these specific parameters. Pause now if you need to read through all of it. If we ran through Silksong using this exact same method, we end up with a list like this. Comparing the two, the biggest change is probably the fact that there are a lot less bosses that require absolutely nothing in order to perfect them. Even less if you remove the ones where you couldn't have an ability before fighting them anyways. Other than that though, the same pattern seems to still hold. Most of the bosses seem to be designed around just the starting moveset plus the dash, while the other upgrades kind of get nothing. I feel the need to reiterate what I said in my last video, in that I know that the overall exploration played a hand in doing this. That the game was so open-ended that some bosses had to be designed around the bare minimum, since they couldn't be 100% confident that you did or didn't have a certain defensive option at that point in the game. However, if you look at this list again, you can see that this isn't always the case. For example, Cruscane Khan, Bell Eater, Tormented Tropio, Watcher at the Edge, Carmelita, and Guardian Seth are all exclusive to Act 3, which means you should have every single movement ability, and yet they all fail to utilize the double jump and the claw line. Lugoli's arena is literally gated off by having the double jump, and she doesn't use it either. The Raging Conchfly doesn't use the claw line, Lace 1 doesn't need the dash, Grandmother Silk only needs the dash, etc, etc. Even when given the opportunity to, a lot of the bosses just don't want to push your full moveset to its full potential. At this point, I think it's apparent that this is just Team Cherry's general philosophy when it comes to designing bosses. That abilities are meant to augment the fight instead of something to design specific moves around. I really don't like this approach, and I think in some ways it's even more disappointing here given how much deeper Hornet's full moveset is overall. So that's it then. A big old fat X with no excuses or compromises whatsoever. Well, yes, and also no. The section about exploration probably should have clued you in on this, but this checklist, while a useful guideline for how Silksong improved from Hollow Knight overall, isn't exactly 100% comprehensive. Not just because I left out the giant one, which, you know, the entire intro to this video was kind of centered around, but also because, as it turns out, game design is really complicated. A simple yes or no won't always paint the full picture. This might sound incredibly contradictory to some of you, but despite everything that I just said, I actually do like the bosses in this game more than the ones in Hollow Knight. Let me explain. First of all, there's the really obvious fact that there's way more to a boss than just this one thing. What playstyles they encourage or discourage, their uniqueness and memorability, and their overall level of difficulty plays a huge part in how good they are as well. Taking into account how poorly they test your moveset and ignoring all of these other aspects would be really disingenuous, especially since in general, Silksong does a much better job across the board in each of these departments. Don't get me wrong, there are some stinkers here. Bosses that take one or two of those aspects and falls flat on their face in addition to my main complaint, but they're clearly in the vast minority of the roster, and after all was said and done, I couldn't really find a boss that hit quite the same lows of the previous game. The second reason I feel this way is because of something on the player's end. Hornet's overall more aggressive moveset. That is to say that while most of the bosses are designed with just the dash in mind, that the Knight with the dash and Hornet with the dash are two pretty different experiences. My favorite change between the two is the addition of a sprint mode and a dash attack. The former allows you to chase down far away enemies more effectively, and the latter is an alternate attack with a surprising amount of complexity to it. If you attack out of a sprint, you'll lunge forward and pop up into the air as though you did a pogo off the enemy. Then, based off what the enemy is doing, you can either dash away for safety or combo into another attack and keep up the aggression. There's also the rare instance where dashing over the enemy is the best choice to avoid damage or to gain some positioning. Another change is how much more offensive Hornet can be at medium range. This is thanks to an initial shorter dash length and the new 45-degree angle diving pogo. In Hollow Knight, if you were too far away to reach with an attack, but also too close to dash in, then you would have had to awkwardly walk into range before you could start attacking. It's why most people recommended equipping the Nail Length Charm in order for the combat in that game to feel just right. The length of Hornet's basic attack is also a bit on the stubby side without the equivalent trinket, but since the initial length of her dash is a bit shorter, it means that its dead range is much smaller. The changes to the pogo and the air dash allows for something similar, just this time in the air. So Hornet's moveset with the dash is much more aggressive and has a bit more nuance. What does that have to do with the bosses? Well, what I'm trying to say is that while the bosses do repeat this mistake of not properly forcing out all of your defensive options, that I still like them more overall because the moveset with the dash is way more fun for me than it was in Hollow Knight. Again, I would have loved it if they went all the way, but bosses are still improved by this overall stronger foundation in Silksong's retooled combat system. As a result, that pattern of my favorite bosses in the game also being the ones that tested all of your abilities isn't as prevalent in Silksong as it was in Hollow Knight. In theory, that would have been Nihilith, and while she still is in my top 5, my absolute favorite bosses are the ones where this extra aggressive playstyle really gets to shine, like Lost Lace, Carmelita, and the First Sinner. In the end, this is in fact an X for the checklist, but just like how the exploration point was a shoddy yes, this one is a shoddy no. I can't emphasize enough that this is just a guideline and not the whole picture. There are still a lot more changes that Silksong has made outside of this checklist. Some good, some bad, and some changes that kind of just depend on your own taste. Changes like the difficulty. So, you made it to the end of the video. Congratulations. You know, I really did think that last section with old me would be enough to make you stop watching. I mean, I guess you could have skipped because I told you to, but hey, for me in this video, time is linear, okay? The reason I was hoping that you would leave is because of the answers that I had promised in regards to the intro to this video. Why do I like being annoyed? Why do I like being hurt? It's not an answer that I'm especially proud of. I mean, it's not uncommon either, but I'm still somewhat ashamed of the binding implications behind it all. Though, I guess since you made it 50 minutes into this video, it's only fair that I put a sock in it and just tell you already. No preamble, no stalling, no more setup. The reason I like being annoyed is because I'm unemployed. Yep, that's the reason. Turns out that when you're stuck in a tiny box all day for weeks on end, you slowly start to learn that one of the worst things that you can actually feel in life is boredom. This is an opinion that you'll see a lot of other people talk about when discussing movies as well. That they would rather something be incredibly horrible than simply whatever. A bad movie can be laughed at, it's better at drumming up discussion, and it can actually leave something of an impression on you. In some ways, that makes it more valuable of an experience than something that is only as okay and plain as white bread. While not exactly the same thing, something similar tends to happen to me when playing video games as well, in that I would rather be annoyed and even outright angry at a game rather than be bored by it. For as much as I hate the flying enemies that constantly try to interrupt platforming while staying just outside of my range, if you told me that they were to be replaced with enemies that just charged at you, then there would be a part of me that would be genuinely sad. It's a lot like my feelings on Deep Nets from the first Hollow Knight actually, in that being engaging is one of the best parts about it, even if it's a bit annoying. That doesn't mean that every bad thing about Silksong gets a pass though. If you paid attention to some of my criticisms so far, such as the runbacks, the harsh beginning, and the quests, it's easy to see that I hate them more so because they're boring and simple. The runbacks really are just a waste of time. The quests kind of speak for themselves, and the beginning difficulty goes about it in the most one-note way possible by simply pumping up the damage from every source. There is a difference between something that is annoying and engaging and something that is annoying and boring. To bolster my argument further, I'm going to be compiling a list of every single thing in Silksong that falls into the latter category and everything that falls into the former. I'm going to go through every single one of these examples and show you step by step what exactly I'm talking about when I call something engaging. Firstly, we can start with the